Greetings, everyone. Brett Nackman from the College Autism Network here. We are really glad to have you for this August 2024 Canvas meeting with our presenter, Dr. Natalie Libster. We'll get to Natalie's work in just a few minutes, but we want to just express our appreciation for having you here. We know it's the dog days of summer and almost really the end of the summer for many of us. And as we often do with our meetings to kind of get things started is providing a little prompt in the chat for folks to respond to if you're so inclined. So the prompt for this month is, what has been your favorite memory or experience from the summer? So if you'd like to share in the chat or would like to turn your microphone off and share what you've been up to, we'd be glad to hear it. And you can answer attending a Canvas presentation, but that is not necessarily a required answer. And any thoughts, folks? All right, we have some thoughts rolling in the chat. Kathy spent time at the lake with family. Lee, our executive director, welcomed a new grandbaby. Mackenzie has taken in some live music. Gabriella spent 2 weeks away in Portugal, a wonderful country. Jesse's also engaged in some travel. Very nice. This is definitely the time to hop on a flight if you can get a decent rate, which is always hard to come by. And outdoor time tends to obviously be a huge priority. See, Mark picked the answer of this, which is the Disney 100 exhibition in Kansas City. Very much agree, Mark. That's, as a big Disney fan, I can definitely attest to that being a great exhibition. I saw it in Philly last year. So definitely some travel for folks and some fun experiences. Catherine went to California and Colorado, so apparently hitting all the states that start with the letter C. Amy was cooking for parents during the 4th of July. Very nice. Hopefully there was some very appropriate dishes for the holiday. More travel. Sabrina went to Nevada and Utah for the National Ability Center. Very cool. Very nice. So lots of travel on the docket for folks. Well, it sounds like people have definitely taken advantage of some time off, and I think that's just a good reminder for all of us to take a break from some of the work that often hits us. So thanks for indulging in that. And I think maybe we'll get some travel recommendations from folks who have charted all over the states and a few outside of the US as well. Well, as a reminder, we always have a lot of things going on in the College Autism Network community. So a few reminders. Of course, many of you are already subscribed to our Canvas listserv. This is where you'll hear about our future presentations, get meeting recordings, so that way you can watch them after the fact on YouTube and share them with folks in your own networks. Also, there's a lot of benefits associated with formally joining College Autism Network via a membership. It offers a variety of benefits, including discounts for our College Autism Summit, which is a mere 2 weeks, excuse me, 2 months. I don't want to scare our director, Lee, 2 months away, not 2 weeks. That would be very alarming if it was that close. And for that, as we are getting much closer to our annual event, I'll turn it over to Lee Williams to talk about what's in store for the College Autism Summit in 2 months. Lee.
Yes, that is a kind of scary thought. We're just a little over 2 months, and I will drop this link right in there. If you haven't registered, you should. We're still in our regular rate period, I think, until the middle of September. But our hotel rooms at the Renaissance Hotel, the discounted hotel rooms, there is a limited number of those, so you want to get registered and get your room. We had an amazing turnout of program proposals, and we're really excited about the quality of the research and practice focused sessions that that we'll be offering. We have poster sessions as well, and because we had to order a certain number of poster walls to put posters on, we have a couple of slots that if you or you know somebody who's already got a poster made and would just be willing to send it to us or come to Columbus and show it, we'd be happy to display that poster. The more the merrier for when it comes to research, right? So hopefully we'll see you in Columbus, and it'll be great. Thanks, Brett.
Thank you, Lee. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the programming. I think we have a really full slate that's going to appeal to a variety of different interests. So hope you all can join us, or at least tell a friend or colleague who might be interested. At this point, this is a space during our Canvas presentation meeting where we turn it over to all of you. Are there any research studies that you feel like the rest of the community should know about? Have you read an interesting article, discovered a cool resource, or do you even have like an announcement to share or something positive that's happening in your line of work related to autism and higher education? This is a great few minutes for sharing any updates or interesting pieces of information. So I'll mute myself and see if other folks would like to contribute any thoughts.
One thing that I'll mention is that next week we have a program directors call. Our program directors listserv, or program leaders listserv. It's a pretty loose affiliation of people who work within the autism support programs across the country and beyond. So if you're not on that list and you want to be, just let me know. We're having a call with two professionals who run parent coach professionals. And they're going to be doing just a talk about some of the parent strategies that they have found effective in communicating with parents who are working with their students, making these transitions from high school to college. And so anybody's welcome to join this. And if you're not on that list, send me an email and I will make sure you get the link. But that's on Wednesday, the 14th at 4 p.m. Eastern time.
Good deal. Thanks for sharing that out, Lee. And it looks like Mark shared an article that comes from the Telegraph. That was a kind of a more medicalized article regarding autism that might prompt some reflection from what it seems like just taking a cursory view. So that might be an interesting read for folks. Thanks for sharing. Mark, anyone else? Well, if there are ideas or resources that come to mind, feel free to drop them in the chat. I think folks are just ready to go and learning from you, Natalie. So I think we're going to turn it over to you at this point. I will gladly have you introduce yourself more fully, but glad to have you here. We have Dr. Natalie Libster, postdoctoral research fellow at Vanderbilt University's Medical Center, and many of us know Vanderbilt well because that's where we've hosted our College Autism Summit in past years, and really appreciate you being here to discuss you and colleagues' work around a much more sensitive and important topic in the autism community as it pertains to sexual victimization. There's certainly not, as I'm sure you'll talk to more fully, there's not as much conversation about this at times, but certainly very needed for those of us who work with autistic college students and young adults to be mindful of and supporting everyone. So we'll turn over to you, Natalie. We invite all of you, as you have questions and comments, to put those in the chat, and we'll allocate time during, or more likely than not at the very end, to have you address them. So over to you, Dr. Libster.
Thanks so much for the introduction. So let me go ahead and share my screen, make sure it's working. And there we go. Can everyone see my slides?
Looks good, Natalie.
Okay, perfect. Well, yeah, like Brett said, my name is Natalie Libster. I'm a postdoc at Vanderbilt Medical Center. First off, thank you all so much again for having me. I really enjoy learning about all the amazing work that Canvas does. So yeah, I'm just really honored that you asked for me to come today and present some of my research. So I'm going to be talking about a study that I completed a few years ago on predictors of sexual victimization among autistic and non-autistic college students. I completed this study a few years ago when I was in grad school at UCLA under the mentorship of Connie Kazari. I do want to mention before moving forward that I will be talking about topics related to sexual violence that can be triggering or upsetting to some. So just wanted to let you all know before I'm continuing on with the presentation. Also, please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. I'm not sure if I will be able to see the chat based on how my screen is. So if you write something in the chat and I don't see it, please feel free to just interrupt me so that I could, answer any clarification questions. So sexual victimization is a critical and prevalent issue on college campuses. Among college students in the US, 26% of women and 7% of men have experienced non-consensual sexual contact by force or by the inability to consent. So that's about 1 in 5 female students who is sexually assaulted. And only 1 in 8 student victims report these instances of sexual victimization. And sexual victimization is associated with extremely negative mental health outcomes. So victims of sexual assault are much more likely to experience depressive episodes on a daily basis and throughout their lifetime compared to those who are not victims. So as you can see in this figure here to the right, 30% of victims of rape experience lifetime depression, and 21% experience daily depressive episodes, compared to those who haven't experienced rape. 10% experience lifetime depression, and 6% experience daily depressive episodes. So it's the mental health outcomes associated with sexual victimization are severe. So adults with disabilities are also more likely than adults without disabilities to experience sexual victimization. On this figure is from a study by Camp and colleagues that looked at sexual assault among adults with and without disabilities. So the red line represents adults with a disability. The blue line represents those without a disability. This x-axis is alcohol consumption, but if you look at adults who never consumed alcohol all the way to the left, you'll see that those with disabilities are almost twice as likely than those without a disability to experience sexual assault. And the authors found that disability status produced greater odds of sexual assault than any other risk factor, including binge drinking. So adults with disabilities are, especially at risk. So it's well known that autistic youth and adults regularly experience imbalances of power that affect their relationships and increase their likelihood of experiencing interpersonal victimization. For example, an autistic participant in a study by Pearson and colleagues reported, because I could not support myself, I had to live with and please men who were willing to have a live-in girlfriend. This trapped me in relationships where I had none of the power. Autistic adults have further expressed difficulty recognizing their intuition about safety in relationships. So an autistic participant in a study by Gibbs and Pelicano reported, I didn't know that I was in a dangerous relationship. I should have. There were red flags that seem very obvious now. And finally, autistic adults have reported that the desire to please others has led to interpersonal victimization. So an autistic participant in another study by Pearson and colleagues stated, I have been pressured into doing things that I wasn't comfortable with to try to please others who I thought were friends. So this abuse of power may characterize the relationships of autistic college students, putting them at increased risk for sexual victimization. So we know that autistic youth and adults experience higher rates of interpersonal victimization than non-autistic individuals, but it's a bit unclear whether they're at increased risk for sexual victimization. A systematic review by Dyke and colleagues of 22 studies examining sexual victimization among autistic youth and adults yielded inconsistent results. So 9 of the review studies found higher rates of sexual victimization among autistic groups, whereas the remaining studies didn't find significant differences. Studies that have examined sexual victimization among autistic college students have also yielded inconsistent results. So the discrepancies in these findings may have been due to methodological inconsistencies across these studies, such as differences in participant characteristics. And also the mixed findings may have been attributed to the presence of other disabilities in the autistic and non-autistic groups. So autistic and non-autistic students who have certain disabilities may be at increased risk of sexual victimization. For example, adults with ADHD experience higher rates of intimate partner violence and sexual victimization compared to adults without ADHD. So it's really important to control for other disabilities when examining sexual victimization among autistic and non-autistic college students. So the first aim of the current study was to examine whether autistic college students are more likely than non-autistic students to experience unwanted sexual contact and sexual assault, controlling for co-occurring diagnoses. So as many as 70 to 79% of autistic adults meet criteria for at least one co-occurring condition. Anxiety, depression, and ADHD are among the most prevalent co-occurring conditions in autistic adults. And the second aim of the study was to examine whether students with other disabilities, specifically ADHD, learning disability, and psychological disorders, are more likely than students without these disabilities to experience unwanted sexual contact and sexual assault. So the current study analyzed secondary data collected by the Diverse Learning Environments, or DLE survey, which was developed and maintained by the Higher Education Research Institute, or HARI, at UCLA. So the survey is administered to undergraduate students at 2-year colleges and at 4-year institutions. And beginning in 2017, the DLE survey presented students with a list of disabilities and asked them to select the ones that they were diagnosed with. Over 53,000 students completed the DLE between 2017 and 2020. And in the current study, autistic students were matched to a control group of non-autistic students using a very specific case control matching procedure. So matching criteria included gender identity, race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, family income, and college and university. So students were matched on binary dimensions of gender, sexual orientation, and race ethnicity due to the limited number of students who belong to these minority groups. Income was stratified into 4 brackets, and a total of 57 colleges and universities were represented in the sample, and students were matched on the specific institution that they attended. Autistic and non-autistic students were further matched on reported diagnoses of learning disability, ADHD, and psychological disorders. And autistic students with more than one disability, for example, ADHD and LD, were matched with non-autistic students with those same disabilities. So as you can see in this table, the case control matching procedure was successful. So we were able to match 270 autistic students to 270 non-autistic students on these characteristics. The majority of autistic and non-autistic students were non-Hispanic, white, heterosexual, attended a 4-year institution, and had a psychological disorder. And the sample was approximately 50% men and women. So on the DLE, students were given the following definitions of unwanted sexual contact and sexual assault. So unwanted sexual contact included unwanted nonverbal behavior, verbal behavior, and physical contact. And sexual assault included committed or attempted acts of a sexual nature without the victim freely giving consent, or against someone who was unable to provide consent. So students were then asked, since you entered college, have you had any unwanted sexual contact? And then they were asked, since you entered college, has someone sexually assaulted or attempted to sexually assault you? So using logistic regression, we first tested whether demographic variables predicted sexual contact and sexual assault. The presence of a disability and sexual orientation were not included in the final models to meet the assumptions of logistic regression, specifically multicollinearity. So of the students in the sample who did not have a disability, only one had experienced sexual contact and one had experienced sexual assault. And there was also a significant association between gender and sexual orientation. So the majority of the men in the sample were heterosexual, while the majority of women were non-heterosexual. We further found that gender was a significant predictor of sexual contact and sexual assault. So women were over 6 times more likely than men to have experienced sexual contact, and they were over 9 times more likely to have experienced sexual assault. So gender was therefore included as a covariate in the models. Race and ethnicity, income, and type of institution were not significant predictors of either outcome. So we then ran 2 logistic regression models to examine predictors of sexual contact and sexual assault. So predictors included reported diagnoses of autism, ADHD, LD, and psychological disorder. And in addition to gender, we also controlled for total social participation. So prior research has shown that undergraduate women who belong to a greater number of clubs and organizations experience higher rates of sexual victimization. So we wanted to control for this in our models. Students were asked whether they had joined any of the following activities since entering college, and those are listed here at the bottom. So we then totaled the number of social groups that students belong to create social participation scores, which ranged from 0 to 7. So these are the estimates of our models. 14% of the total sample had experienced at least one form of sexual contact. And we found that ADHD diagnostic status, but not autism, was a significant predictor of sexual contact. So students with ADHD were 1.98 times more likely than students without ADHD to have experienced sexual contact. So that's 22% of students with ADHD versus 12% of students without ADHD. Meanwhile, 8% of the total sample had experienced sexual assault. And similar to sexual contact, we found that ADHD diagnostic status, but not autism, was a significant predictor of sexual assault. So students with ADHD were 2.16 times more likely than those without ADHD to have experienced sexual assault. And that's 13% of students with ADHD compared to 6% of students without. So since ADHD was found to be a significant predictor of sexual contact and sexual assault, we ran 2 additional logistic regression models to test whether the likelihood of experiencing sexual victimization differed amongst students with only ADHD and students with a combination of ADHD and other diagnoses. The directionality of the relationship between psychological disorder and sexual victimization is unclear, so we included this variable as a covariate in the models. We also controlled for gender and social participation score. An interaction between gender and co-occurring diagnostic status was also included in the models. However, this interaction was not significant in either model, so we ended up taking it out just to make the results of the models more interpretable. So here are the results of the final models. Students without ADHD were 0.4 times less likely than students with only ADHD to have experienced sexual contact. And students without ADHD were 0.32 times 0.32 times less likely than students with only ADHD to have experienced sexual assault. So students who had ADHD and one or more co-occurring diagnosis were as likely as students with only HD to have experienced sexual victimization. So, based on these findings, we can conclude that ADHD is really what's driving this increased risk of sexual victimization among autistic and non-autistic college students. So yeah, again, the results of the study demonstrate that autistic and non-autistic students with ADHD are at increased risk of sexual victimization. And a recent study by Gibbs and colleagues supported these findings. So they found that ADHD places individuals at higher risks of multiple forms of violence, including physical violence, sexual violence, and stalking and harassment, regardless of autism status. It is important to note that ADHD is extremely common among autistic youth and adults. It's one of the most common co-occurring conditions, as previously mentioned, with a prevalence rate of 20 to 37%. And it's also important to note that although autistic adults in the present sample were not at risk of being victimized, autistic adults may have had difficulty identifying abusive behaviors from sexual partners. So these adults may therefore underreport occurrences of sexual violence if they're unable to detect abusive behaviors. So the current study highlights the importance of social and institutional supports to decrease sexual victimization among college students with neurodevelopmental disabilities. Autistic adults have expressed the importance of having relationships with people they can trust and turn to for support and protection. And prior research has also found that faculty support is protective against interpersonal victimization among autistic and non-autistic college students. However, college faculty often have limited knowledge of neurodevelopmental disability and lack confidence in supporting these students. I also wanted to share the results of this 538 poll to the right. This is from 2015, so it's been a few years, but you could see that 78% of college presidents disagreed that sexual assault was prevalent at their institutions. And over a quarter disagreed that sexual assault was prevalent at any US college. So not only is there a need for greater awareness and acceptance of neurodiversity on college campuses, but there's also a need for campus climates that focus on the prevention of sexual violence. So if you all want to, read this study in full, it was published in JAD, or Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders. I also included my contact information below if you have any questions or, just wanted to reach out. And yeah, thank you all so much for listening. I'm happy to take this time to answer questions. Again, I couldn't see the chat, so I don't know if any were on there, but happy to take this time, to answer any questions you may have.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Natalie.
Yes.
It doesn't appear there's any questions in the chat now, but I think this is a great time to kind of get the idea juices flowing in folks' minds in terms of wanting to post some thoughts, and maybe I'll start us off to kind of get the ball rolling. This was obviously very insightful and particularly interesting in terms of seeing the role of ADHD in concert with or independent of autism. I'm wondering from your standpoint, how so many folks in our campus community are practitioners who work on college campuses and work with autistic learners. What efforts do you feel like can be increased among autism programs and in disability services spaces and more of these autism affinity spaces, if you will, to elevate conversation about consent and just how should I put it, not putting oneself or not being in a vulnerable situation, because obviously there's a lot of layers of communication and as you said from previous work, this notion of wanting to please others or appease to other folks. It's a very complicated nuance, and I'm not probably justifying it, but I'm wondering for folks who are practitioners, what can they do to elevate understanding and conversation around not being in a vulnerable space?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and something that I've heard, anecdotally, and I've read quite a bit in the autism literature, is just this lack of education from autistic adolescents and young adults about just sexuality, about consent, about identifying potentially harmful behaviors, and just not getting sex education. Either it's not available to them because there's this notion that, this very ableist notion that folks with disabilities aren't sexually active or aren't interested, right? And so sex education is often, not accessible. So that's a huge issue. So making sure that it is accessible, both, I should say, available and accessible, so that not only is it available to folks with neurodevelopmental disabilities, but it's also accessible, right? It's presented in a way that meets their needs, especially because kind of from what the quotes demonstrated earlier in the presentation, a lot of autistic folks and folks with other neurodevelopmental disabilities might have trouble identifying what consent is, or these potential, vulnerable situations. And if they're not taught and if they're not educated, they won't know, right? We shouldn't expect that of them. So that's just really important, making sure that there are educational sources that are targeted for the neurodiverse community, about, consent and safe sexual practices. And again, these institutional supports, I know this is a bigger issue to tackle, but, kind of thinking, well, no one should be sexually victimized, right? Regardless of disability status. So how can we stop this on campuses? How can we promote safe campus climates, and reduce sexual victimization on college campuses? And I mean, I think that all really just stems from awareness. Kind of from this 538 poll, a lot of college faculty are in denial that this is an issue, and it's not being talked about. So making sure that it is, and that this issue is prevalent, or more aware on campuses.
Yeah,
If anyone, oh, I'm
go
sorry, I
ahead,
was gonna
Natalie.
say, if anyone has other ideas too, please feel free to chime in or write them in the chat. But
Yeah, no, and I appreciate what you said, Natalie. I think for that poll from a decade ago, it almost reinforces this idea of victim blaming or denial of a reality where unfortunately many folks are victimized. If I can just ask you to stop sharing your
oh,
screen, that way
absolutely.
folks can see you
Oh, sure.
more fully, and we can see everybody else more fully. Thanks for addressing that. We have some other questions rolling in. One is from Mackenzie, who poses this question. What do you suspect students with ADHD, or why do you suspect students with ADHD were at increased risk of sexual victimization? Why do you suspect autism was not a significant predictor, if understanding that point correctly?
Yeah, that's also a really great question. I'll start with ADHD, and then address the question about autism. And I actually got this question from a reviewer, because in my paper they asked me to explain why that might be the case with ADHD, why these students might be at risk of victimization. And it was kind of hard to answer. And that's because, I mean, we know that there are certain behaviors that are higher among adults with ADHD. They tend to have more sexual partners. They tend to be sexually active at an earlier age. They tend to maybe have higher rates of alcohol consumption. That being said, though, kind of what I mentioned earlier, we don't want to victim blame. So it doesn't matter how many sexual partners a person has, right? They shouldn't be victimized. It doesn't matter at what age they start engaging in sexual activity, they shouldn't be victimized. That, and again, even if they are might have some of those inattentive behaviors associated with ADHD, and might not be aware that they're in a dangerous situation, that still you know, they shouldn't be victimized. So again, in my paper, I really try to put the onus on the perpetrator, right? How can we prevent people from sexually abusing autistic college students, especially those who might be particularly vulnerable, right? So not just those with disabilities, but also women, right? And sexual minorities who we know are more likely to experience increased rates of sexual victimization. And then with autism, right? Again, you know, could be that autistic students just aren't aware of these behaviors, right? And so, and I could kind of share a kind of more anecdotal story. I have a friend who is a Title IX attorney, and she gets a lot of cases where it's actually an autistic person who is accusing, and who it was two partners who are both autistic, and it was a case of sexual victimization, where it was the person who was being accused didn't realize that there was just kind of like a miscommunication in terms of consent. And so it gets really tricky because a lot of colleges just don't know what to do with the situation, and they get lawyers involved, right? Which kind of shows that there's a problem at the institutional level. That again, there's not enough educational resources about consent and things like that. So yeah, it is a problem that just really needs to be addressed on kind of the broader scale. I hope that answers your question.
All right, well, it looks like we have a question from Amy who has a hand raised, and then we'll turn it back over to the chat. Go ahead, Amy.
Thanks, Brett. Natalie, thank you for your presentation. It's been very interesting. I am an autistic adult myself, and so I have lived this experience of being in college and being that vulnerable person who did experience abusive things. But the issue, I think, when we talk about autism potentially is not a predictor, is the fact, it's not just the fact that it's underreported, but that these things are so normalized that there is no way to even, do you know what I mean? So the things that I think back to in college, there was no concept of this really isn't normal. This really isn't okay. This was just what happened. You know, as a woman, especially, I was expected to kind of yield to the sexual needs of others, of men especially. And I didn't have, you know, a sense of confidence and self-awareness to stand up for myself and to say, like, no, I don't want to do this. And so all these things, it's the very thing that makes autistic people more likely to be victims, to be perfect victims, is the thing that causes this not to be reported in the first place. So it's kind of a vicious cycle type of thing, but it doesn't eliminate the problem. In fact, I think it throws sharp relief on the problem because, you know, like this is what we're talking about. And so I just, I think, yeah, it's the normalization to me that is the hugest thing, that perpetrators are able to convince autistic victims that this is so, like, you know, and we don't teach people what abuse looks like prior to these incidents occurring. Like, we don't provide exemplars and show how it can be very subtle. It can be emotional, it can be verbal, it can be physical, it can be financial, comes in all these different, so just that lack of education is all feeds into that. And then again, it just becomes that vicious cycle. Well, it's not reported, so therefore it must not be a problem. So therefore we're not going to talk about it and do anything about it. And it's just so damaging. It's so damaging, especially to autistic individuals. So I'm glad you're doing this research, and I think we definitely need more looking at that.
Yeah, Amy, Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, I mean, and I know kind of before I was talking about education for autistic individuals and individuals with neurodevelopmental disabilities, but I think you highlighted the point that we need education for everyone, right? Education on not to victimize others, to promote these safe, sexual experiences, because yeah, an autistic person might not know that they're being victimized until later, right? Until they gain that insight as an adult, because the participants in my study and many of these studies, they're, late adolescents, early 20s. Like, you don't tend to gain that insight until later. But, if they weren't being victimized in the first place or in that situation in the first place, and I shouldn't say if the person that they were with weren't engaging in those behaviors, I should say, in the first place, then they wouldn't have to experience that. So yeah, definitely teaching the global community not to engage in abusive behaviors. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for that contribution there, Amy. A lot for us to think through. We have a kind of a tether to what we've been discussing. Bella poses in the chat a very broad question, but very applicable to everybody. How can campuses reduce the risk of sexual victimization? I know you've alluded to some of this already, Natalie, but perhaps you can think about it at a bigger scale.
Yeah, that is a great question. I know there have been so many efforts in the past 10, 15 years. Not, efforts doesn't mean they were effective, right? Because sexual victimization does indeed occur. But I think just kind of, yeah, to be honest, I think it starts maybe even before college too, right? So talking about consent, talking about, even at the high school level, when we're having conversations about sexual practices and sex education, consent should be a part of the curriculum. And, the dangers of, again, alcohol consumption, not for the victim, but of the perpetrator and things like that, where, again, if those things tend to be associated when the perpetrator drinks alcohol. Again, those inhibitions can cause them to engage in those, predatory behaviors. So, all of that needs to just be talked about. And, I think recently there has been, I should say, again, more awareness than I should say, yeah, more awareness. There obviously could be more. But yeah, and again, getting rid of this culture of victim blaming. I think it all kind of starts with the faculty and the administrators at the school kind of changing that, engaging in those conversations and changing that culture. I know that's not the most satisfying answer, just personally. I'm not someone who just kind of does research. I don't really have a lot of experience in the college space or in doing administrative work. So I'm not sure how that particularly can be tackled, but I think it definitely needs to be talked about kind of at the institutional level.
Thanks for that, Natalie. And I'll just add to, as someone who studies higher education, I think it's so imperative for the administrators, the folks who have the greatest influence, to be able to embed that in their institutional priorities. And I think certainly some of that older data you shared showcases a sense of ignorance. But boy, like it goes a long way when you have people at the top committing themselves and espousing it and making sure it's articulated in programming, particularly for via freshman orientation and other spaces, and in residential housing and other spaces. But I think you allude to a lot of really essential reflection points about how colleges can only do so much. It goes back to in the family, household, and high schools. So just, I guess, adding some further reflection there. We have some other good questions in the chat. Another one's from Mackenzie. Based on the results of this study, where do you feel like the research needs to go next?
That's a great question. So I didn't talk about this in the presentation, but I most certainly did in my, paper about some of the limitations. And one of that being, again, we weren't able to look at sexual minority status in the paper, again, because there was that significant association between gender and sexual orientation. So it just analytically, we weren't able to do it. But there, it is pretty well known that folks with sexual minorities as well as gender minorities are at increased risk for victimization. So making sure we understand their sexual victimization experiences in ways that institutions can protect them from being sexually victimized. And especially in the autistic community, because we know that, there's greater gender and sexual diversity in autistic samples than in the general population, which may even exponentially increase their risk of being victimized, right? This kind of idea of double minority stress. So folks with multiple minoritized identities are at increased risk of victimization. So making sure that we really look into that more deeply, I think would be an important next step.
Indeed. Kathy has a question. Have you considered looking at the level of social involvement of autistic students as another variable? Many students in my sphere are less likely to be at parties, pubs, date, etc. They tend to have a smaller familial social circle, less likely to drink, and then therefore maybe less likely to be in situations where a perpetrator might assault them. Therefore, it may be that they are still vulnerable if in a risky situation compared to non-autistic folks. And then Amy offered some thoughtful commentary in the chat toward that end. But what are your interpretations of that, Natalie?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So and we kind of found that even though social participation was a covariate in our models, we did find that it was significantly associated with sexual contact and sexual assault. So those who were more socially involved experienced higher rates of sexual victimization. And again, that was really difficult to interpret and talk about in the discussion because we don't want to say that people should just stay inside and not do things and then they won't experience sexual victimization. They should be able to do whatever they want, go to as many pubs or parties that they want and not fear have this fear of being sexually victimized, just like how folks should be able to have sexual partners and not fear being victimized. So again, I think the crux and the implication, that could be potentially why autism wasn't a significant predictor in our models. We weren't able to determine that. But again, it's just really changing the culture around safe environments, right? Whether that be a party or a pub, a romantic relationship. That's really the key, I think.
Thanks, Nellie. And thank you, Kathy, for that question too, and Amy for the comment. Kathy, it looks like you have your question raised, or your hand raised. Go for it.
Hi, sorry. Again, apologies for my appearance. I was in the lake. That was certainly not a comment on how autistic students shouldn't be in any space on campus that they want to be. My experience with my students is really more that they tend not to be because they find us non-autistic people difficult. And that's a problem too, that they don't feel comfortable in non-autistic spaces because non-autistic people are a challenge. So it was absolutely not a comment on that. More just a comment
as such, yeah.
Yeah, just wanted to clarify that.
No,
Just another variable, which it looks like you looked at, and that was interesting.
we did, yeah. And again, it was I got that comment from a reviewer too, and it's tricky, right? Because it's like, how do we just change the topic around it? Because yeah, studies do show that autistic students tend to be less integrated in the college community. They tend to feel like less of a sense of belonging on campus. Kathy, kind of as you mentioned, that they don't feel accepted and welcomed by other non-autistic students a lot of the time. So that definitely could be a reason, but again, it's about how can we make them feel more welcome on campus and engage. I feel like that's another study. But yeah, that's, also really important so that they can feel safe and welcome and that they can engage in more activities. Yeah.
Alrighty, well, I think we're almost at about time to wrap up, but some really, really useful reflection points, I think, for so many of us, Natalie, about this topic, and you covered some past work related to this, and I saw one of the people who you cited was joining us for the Canvas call today, so I think all of you are contributing really valuable work, and it seems like there's also opportunities to further disentangle some of the data based on other core identities and experiences that folks in the autism community are a part of. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights. Yeah, and I think it's an invitation for all of us to read the full article and to read other related work to see how hopefully the narratives can change, and hopefully there's less victimization for all students, and for the nature of your work in the autism and ADHD communities too. So thank you, Natalie. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us for this August presentation. It's, again, summer's nearing the end, so hope folks continue to get that last minute trip or outdoor time taken it while the weather's still, I guess it depends on where you are. Maybe it's too uncomfortable to be outside right now, but hope folks are at least getting some fresh air. We will see you all back here via one of our Canvas presentations in September. So we're going to see you on Friday, September 13th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're going to have Dr. Dana Kanhai, who recently graduated from Michigan State University, and their work is on the faculty side in terms of faculty response to autistic college students, essentially examining supportive behaviors and beliefs, which is a topical point that so many of us continue to discuss and try to build upon. So we will see you all then. In the interim, video recording of today's presentation will be available in about the next week. And we encourage you to engage with the listserv, share resources that come available. We know many of you are starting the academic year and probably going to be working more with your students or reading more articles or whatever the case may be. So definitely use the Canvas listserv to serve you and your work and support others along the way. And we hope to see more of you register for the College Autism Summit, which is a mere 2 months away. So thank you all for being here, and we'll see you all again very soon. Take care.